The rescue. The battlefield was a wasteland of fire and smoke. Captain Jake Walker, a seasoned Earth Marine, stood on the edge of a crater, scanning the horizon. The distant sound of explosions echoed through the air, but Jake's focus was sharp. His team was retreating to their dropship after a dangerous mission on the hostile planet Gyrath. The mission was clear: retrieve Earth's stolen tech and leave. No unnecessary risks. But then, something caught his attention. A faint, crackling sound came through his comm device. A distress signal. Jake frowned. "What's that?" he muttered to himself. "Captain, we've got no time for distractions," his second-in-command, Corporal Jenkins, called out. "The dropship is waiting." Jake adjusted his headset, tuning in to the signal. It was weak, almost drowned by static. But there was a voice. Soft, desperate, and alien. He couldn't make out the words, but it was a plea for help. "Someone's out there," Jake said, his voice steady but concerned. Jenkins frowned. "Captain, this planet is crawling with Andarian troops. If we don't leave now, we're dead." Jake hesitated. The Andarians were Earth's enemies, and this war had already cost humanity too much. But Jake couldn't ignore the call. He had a rule. No one gets left behind, even if they weren't human. "Jenkins, take the team to the dropship. I'll catch up," Jake ordered, grabbing his plasma rifle and heading toward the signal. "Captain, this is suicide," Jenkins shouted, but Jake was already moving. The terrain was harsh: jagged rocks, smoking craters, and pools of toxic sludge. Jake's boots crunched against the ground as he followed the signal. The voice grew clearer, leading him toward a collapsed Andarian transport ship. Inside the wreckage, the air was thick with smoke. Jake activated his helmet's filter and moved cautiously. His rifle was raised, ready for any threat. Then he saw her. An alien figure lay trapped under a piece of the ship's hull. Her silver armor was dented and scorched, and her shimmering blue skin was marred with cuts and bruises. Despite her injuries, her presence was regal and commanding. This was no ordinary soldier. Jake approached slowly. The alien's golden eyes flickered open, locking onto him. She flinched, reaching for a weapon, but her strength failed her. "Easy," Jake said, lowering his rifle. "I'm not here to hurt you." The alien's voice was faint but sharp. "Human. Why? Help me." Jake hesitated for a moment, then began lifting the heavy metal piece off her. "I don't know. Maybe because I can't stand to see anyone die like this." The metal groaned as Jake pushed it aside. The alien gasped in pain but didn't cry out. Jake quickly assessed her injuries. Her leg was crushed, and her breathing was labored. "We need to get you out of here," Jake said, pulling a medkit from his pack. The alien shook her head weakly. "You do not know what you are doing." Jake ignored her protests and injected her with a painkiller. Then he heard it, a low growl, followed by the sound of claws scraping against metal. His blood ran cold. He turned, spotting movement in the shadows. A pack of scarven beasts, vicious predators native to Gyrath, emerged from the wreckage. Their razor-sharp teeth gleamed as they snarled, their eyes fixed on Jake and the injured alien. "Great," Jake muttered, gripping his rifle tighter. The first scarven lunged at him. Jake fired, the plasma bolt hitting it square in the chest. The beast fell, but the others were already closing in. Jake placed himself between the alien and the predators, firing rapidly. "Stay down," he shouted over his shoulder. The alien watched in disbelief as Jake fought with unrelenting determination. Each shot was precise, every movement calculated. Despite the odds, Jake held his ground. The last scarven leaped at him, claws outstretched. Jake sidestepped and delivered a crushing blow with the butt of his rifle, sending the beast crashing to the ground. Breathing heavily, Jake turned to the alien. "We need to move. Now." He knelt beside her and lifted her into his arms. She was surprisingly light, her armor cool against his skin. The alien didn't resist, though her gaze was filled with a mix of confusion and something else. Gratitude, perhaps. As Jake carried her through the wreckage, she whispered, "You are a fool, human." "Yeah, I get that a lot," Jake replied with a small smirk. The dropship came into view, its engines humming. Jenkins stood at the ramp, his expression a mix of relief and frustration. "What the hell, Captain?" Jenkins yelled as Jake boarded with the alien. "No time to explain," Jake said, setting her down carefully. "Get us out of here." As the ship lifted off, the alien grabbed Jake's arm. Her voice was barely audible, but carried a chilling weight. "You have saved me, human, but by doing so, you have doomed yourself." Jake stared at her, his heart pounding. What had he gotten himself into? The truth unveiled. The hum of the dropship's engines filled the cabin as it soared through Giraffe's turbulent skies. Captain Jake Walker sat across from the alien he had just rescued, his rifle resting beside him. His team was silent, their eyes flicking between their captain and the strange figure slumped on the bench. The atmosphere was tense, charged with suspicion and confusion. The alien, still weak but conscious, sat upright with a regal poise that didn't match her battered state. Her golden eyes scanned the humans around her, calculating, observing. Jake noticed the way she carried herself. It wasn't just confidence, it was authority. Finally, she broke the silence. "You do not know who I am, do you?" Her voice, though faint, carried a commanding tone. Jake crossed his arms. "Nope. All I know is you needed help, and I couldn't lead you there." The alien tilted her head slightly, a gesture that seemed to mix curiosity and amusement. A human, acting selflessly. Fascinating. She paused, her gaze narrowing. "I am Syra, Queen of the Andarian Empire." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Jenkins, standing near the cockpit, immediately reached for his weapon. "She's the enemy, Captain. What the hell are we doing harboring her?" Jake raised a hand to calm his second-in-command. "Stand down, Jenkins. Let's hear what she has to say." Zyra's lips curved into a faint, almost mocking smile. "Your loyalty to Earth is admirable, human, but your ignorance is dangerous. By saving me, you have involved yourself in matters far beyond your war with my people." Jake leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Then explain. Why were you out there, alone and wounded? Last I checked, queens don't wander into battlefields unguarded." Zyra's expression darkened. "I was betrayed," she said, her voice colder now. "My closest advisors, those I trusted most, orchestrated a coup. They left me for dead on that cursed planet, hoping to seize control of the Empire." Jake frowned, trying to piece the puzzle together. "So your own people turned on you. Why?" Zyra hesitated, as if deciding how much to reveal. "Because I sought peace with your kind. The Andarian Empire has long thrived on conquest, but I saw the cracks forming. The war with Earth has cost us dearly, just as it has cost you. I proposed an alliance, an end to the bloodshed, but many in my court saw that as weakness." Jenkins snorted. "And we're supposed to believe that? Sounds like a convenient story." Jake shot him a warning glance. "Let her finish." Zyra's gaze shifted to Jake, studying him. "I do not expect your trust, human. But know this, if those who betrayed me succeed, they will not stop with me. They will unleash their full might on Earth. You think the war is bad now. It will become annihilation." The cabin fell silent again. Jake felt the weight of her words pressing on him. Was she telling the truth? And if she was, what did it mean for humanity? As if sensing his thoughts, Syra added, "I need to return to my people, to rally those still loyal to me and reclaim my throne. Only then can I stop the madness that will consume both our worlds." Jake ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "And what happens if I say no? If we drop you off somewhere and pretend this never happened?" Zyra's eyes gleamed, and her tone turned sharp. "Then I will die. And when my Empire's fleet arrives at your planet, You will wish you had made a different choice. The dropship jolted suddenly, shaking everyone out of their tense conversation. Jenkins called out from the cockpit, "Captain, we've got incoming. 3 Andarian ships on our tail." Zyra's expression tightened. "They found us. The traitors have sent their hunters." Jake sprang to his feet, adrenaline surging. "Jenkins, evasive maneuvers. Everyone else, prepare for combat." The dropship swerved sharply, the sound of plasma bolts whizzing past the hull. Jake grabbed his rifle and turned to Zyra. "If you want me to believe you, now's your chance. How do we lose them?" Zyra pointed toward the navigation console. "Your ship is slower but more agile. Use the storm clouds ahead. They will interfere with their targeting systems." Jake relayed the instructions to Jenkins, who gritted his teeth but complied. The dropship dived into the roiling clouds, visibility dropping to near zero. The Andarian ships followed, their glowing engines cutting through the gloom like predatory eyes. "Hold on," Jenkins yelled as the ship twisted and turned, dodging plasma fire. Jake braced himself, gripping a support beam. The storm raged around them, lightning illuminating the chasing ships. Zyra suddenly stood, her movements unsteady but purposeful. She reached for a panel on the wall, her fingers flying across the controls. "Your weapon systems are primitive, but they will suffice." She activated the dropship's rear cannons and fired a volley of energy blasts. The shots hit one of the pursuing ships, causing it to spin out of control before exploding in a brilliant flash. Jake raised an eyebrow, impressed despite himself. Not bad for someone who was half dead 5 minutes ago. Zyra didn't respond, her focus entirely on the fight. The remaining 2 ships closed in, their plasma fire relentless. The dropship shook violently as a blast grazed its hull. "Captain, we can't take much more of this," Jenkins shouted. Jake gritted his teeth, his mind racing for a solution. Then Zyra spoke again, her voice steady despite the chaos. "There's a nearby moon with a dense forest. If we can reach it, we can lose them in the terrain. Jenkins, set a course for that moon," Jake ordered. The dropship veered sharply, heading for the moon's surface. The Andarian ships followed, their weapons lighting up the night. Jake and Zyra worked together, firing back and coordinating evasive maneuvers. As the dropship descended into the moon's atmosphere, the forest came into view, a sprawling expanse of towering trees and thick vegetation. The ship dove into the canopy, weaving between the trees at breakneck speed. The Andarian ships hesitated, their larger size making the maneuver dangerous. "Now," Zyra shouted, firing another volley from the rear cannons. The shots hit one of the ships, sending it crashing into the forest below. The final ship pulled back, unwilling to risk the same fate. The dropship finally landed in a clearing, smoke rising from its damaged hull. Jake exhaled deeply, his heart still pounding. He turned to Zyra, who looked equally exhausted. "Well," Jake said, leaning against the wall, "I guess I'm stuck with you now." Zyra managed a faint smile. "And you, Captain Walker, may have just saved more than my life." The escape plan. The dropship sat in the dense moon forest, smoke trailing from its engines. The crew worked frantically to assess the damage, but Captain Jake Walker couldn't shake the tension. He stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his eyes locked on Queen Zyra. She sat on a fallen log, her posture as regal as ever despite her torn armor and obvious fatigue. Jake approached her cautiously. "All right, Your Majesty," he said, the sarcasm in his voice evident. "You've got a plan, right? Because sitting here waiting for your enemies to find us isn't exactly my idea of a good time." Zyra's golden eyes flicked to him. Impatient, as always human. "But yes, I have a plan. First, your crew must repair this primitive vessel. Then we head to my hidden stronghold." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Hidden stronghold. Convenient. And what makes you think it hasn't been compromised like the rest of your empire?" Zyra's lips tightened, because it's known only to me and my most loyal allies. If it's intact, we'll find weapons, ships, and the means to rally my forces." Jake sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "And if it's not intact?" "Then we die," Tyra replied matter-of-factly. "Great," Jake muttered. "Fantastic plan." As the crew worked to patch up the dropship, tension simmered among them. Corporal Jenkins, Jake's second-in-command, wasn't shy about voicing his concerns. "Captain," Jenkins said, pulling Jake aside, "we can't trust her. She's the enemy. For all we know, she's leading us into a trap." Jake glanced back at Tyra, who sat alone, her gaze distant. "Maybe, but what choice do we have? If she's telling the truth, she's the only one who can stop this war from getting worse. And if she's lying," Jenkins pressed, "if this is all some elaborate scheme." Jake's jaw tightened. "Then we deal with it. But for now, she's our best shot." Jenkins shook his head, frustration evident. "You're risking everything for her." "I'm risking everything for peace," Jake shot back. "Remember that." Hours later, as the crew finished repairs, Jake called a meeting. Tyra stood beside him, her commanding presence filling the small clearing. "We have one shot at this," Jake began. "The Andarian ships won't give up easily, so we need to be smart. Tyra says there's a stronghold nearby that can help us turn the tide. We'll head there, but we're going to need to fly low and fast to avoid detection." Jenkins folded his arms. "And if they find us?" "We fight," Jake said simply. His eyes swept over his team. "I know this isn't what we signed up for, but if we pull this off, we could end this war." The crew exchanged uneasy glances, but no one objected. Jake turned to Tyra. "Anything to add?" Tyra stepped forward, her voice steady and commanding. "I know you do not trust me. I do not expect you to. But know this. My betrayal was orchestrated by those who would see both our worlds burn. If you help me, you help ensure a future for your kind." The crew's silence was heavy with doubt, but Jake nodded. "All right, let's move." The dropship rose from the clearing, its engine sputtering but holding steady. Jake sat in the cockpit beside Jenkins, his eyes scanning the radar. "So, where's this stronghold?" Jenkins asked, his tone sharp. Tyra appeared behind them, leaning on the doorway. "It's hidden within the mountain range to the north. The terrain will shield us from scanners, but the journey won't be easy." "Nothing ever is," Jake muttered, gripping the controls. The ship weaved through the dense forest before breaking into open air. As they gained altitude, the mountain range came into view, a jagged expanse of peaks shrouded in mist. Jake couldn't help but feel a pang of unease. It was the perfect place for an ambush. Suddenly, the radar pinged. 3 blips appeared, closing in fast. "Damn it," Jenkins cursed. "They found us." Tyra's expression remained calm, but her eyes were sharp. "We must reach the mountains. They won't risk pursuit in such treacherous terrain." Jake pushed the ship to its limits, the engines roaring as they sped toward the mountains. Behind them, Andarian ships appeared, their sleek designs cutting through the sky like predatory birds. "Brace yourselves," Jake shouted as the first plasma bolts streaked past the ship. He banked hard, narrowly avoiding a direct hit. "Return fire," Jenkins yelled, and the crew sprang into action. The dropship's rear cannons lit up, firing wildly at their pursuers. One of the Andarian ships took a hit, spiraling out of control before exploding in a fiery burst. "2 more," Jenkins called out. The remaining ships closed the distance, their weapons hammering the dropship's shields. The cabin shook violently, sparks flying from the consoles. "Shields are down to 30%, a crew member shouted. "Just a little further," Jake muttered, his knuckles white on the controls. Tyra moved to his side, her voice low but firm. "There's a narrow pass ahead. If you can navigate it, they won't be able to follow." Jake glanced at her. "You're awfully calm for someone who's about to get blown out of the sky." Zyra's lips twitched in a faint smile. Fear is a distraction, Captain. Jake snorted. Good to know. The ship plunged into the mountain pass, the rocky walls looming on either side. Jake's focus was razor-sharp as he guided the ship through the narrow, winding route. Behind them, the Andarian ships hesitated, their larger size making the maneuver risky. Come on, Jake muttered under his breath. One of the pursuing ships attempted to follow but clipped a wing on the rocky wall, spiraling into oblivion. The final ship pulled back, unwilling to risk the same fate. We're clear, Jenkins shouted, relief evident in his voice. Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For now. As they exited the pass, a hidden valley came into view. Nestled within the mountains was an ancient structure, its design unmistakably Andarian, but weathered by time. It was the stronghold Sarah had spoken of. Jake brought the ship down gently, its engine sputtering as they powered off. The crew stepped out, their eyes scanning the imposing structure. Zyra stood beside Jake, her gaze steady. This is where we make our stand. Jake nodded, gripping his rifle. Let's hope it's worth it. Bonds amid betrayal. The hidden Andarian stronghold loomed like a relic of another age. Its towering walls were covered in moss and vines, yet its angular architecture still reflected the power of the empire that built it. Captain Jake Walker stood at the entrance, his rifle slung over his shoulder, studying the alien structure with a mix of caution and curiosity. Behind him, his crew fanned out, weapons drawn, checking for any signs of danger. Queen Zyra moved ahead with surprising confidence despite her injuries. Her silver armor, though battered, still glinted in the faint light of the valley. Jake noticed the way her presence commanded respect, or perhaps fear. Even among humans who didn't trust her, she had an undeniable aura of authority. This place looks abandoned, Jenkins muttered, his eyes scanning the shadows. I don't like it. Zyra turned to him, her golden eyes gleaming. Appearances can be deceiving, Corporal. This stronghold was designed to appear unremarkable to outsiders. But inside, it holds the tools we need. Jake raised an eyebrow. Tools like what? Zyra walked toward the heavy doors at the entrance. She placed her hand on a small panel, and the ancient mechanism hummed to life. With a deep groan, the doors slid open, revealing a cavernous interior filled with dormant technology, ships, weapons, and supplies. The crew gasped as the lights flickered on, illuminating a massive hangar. Tools like these, Zyra said, a hint of pride in her voice. The crew moved quickly, setting up a temporary base inside the stronghold. While they worked, Jake stayed close to Zyra, watching her as much as he was watching their surroundings. She moved through the facility with familiarity, her hands activating consoles and systems that had been silent for years. Your people built all this? Jake asked, breaking the silence. Zyra glanced at him. The Andarian Empire has existed for millennia. What you see here is but a fraction of our capabilities. Jake frowned. And yet your own people betrayed you. Her expression darkened. Power breeds ambition, Captain. The traitors see me as a threat to their vision of endless conquest. They do not realize the cost of their greed, nor do they care. Jake studied her for a moment, his skepticism fading slightly. He could see the weight she carried, the burden of leading an empire in turmoil. It wasn't so different from the responsibilities he bore as a captain. Before he could respond, a sharp whistle came from Jenkins, who was stationed at the entrance. Captain, we've got movement. Jake and Sarah rushed to the doorway, where Jenkins pointed toward the tree line. Several figures were approaching, their forms shrouded in the mist. They moved with purpose, weapons drawn. Hostiles? Jake asked, raising his rifle. Zyra squinted, then her eyes widened. No, they're loyalists. Jake lowered his weapon slightly but kept his guard up. As the figures drew closer, their faces became clear. Andarian soldiers, their armor marked with a sigil Jake hadn't seen before. They stopped a few feet away, their weapons lowering as they saw Xyra. "Your Majesty," one of them said, bowing deeply. "We thought you were lost." "I nearly was," Xyra replied, her voice steady. "But thanks to these humans, I survived. Are there more of you?" The soldier nodded. "Yes, but not many. The rebellion has spread quickly. Most of our forces have been captured or killed." Xyra's expression hardened. "Then we will make do with what we have. Gather everyone here. We'll need every ally we can find." As the Loyalists regrouped, Jake and his team worked alongside them to fortify the stronghold. Despite their differences, the humans and Andarians began to form an uneasy alliance. Jake noticed how Xyra took charge, giving orders with precision and clarity. Her people followed her without question, their loyalty unwavering. But not everyone was convinced. Later that evening, as Jake reviewed their defenses, Jenkins approached him, his face tight with frustration. "Captain, I don't like this," Jenkins said. "We're putting our lives on the line for her, and for what? A chance at peace." Jake sighed. "I get it, Jenkins, but think about what's at stake. If she's telling the truth, we might be able to end this war. Isn't that worth the risk?" Jenkins hesitated, then shook his head. "I hope you're right. But if she turns on us, it's on you." As night fell, the stronghold grew quiet. Most of the crew and Loyalists rested, but Jake couldn't sleep. He found himself in the main hall, where Xyra stood alone, staring at a holographic map of the Andarian Empire. "You're not resting," Jake said, stepping beside her. "Neither are you," Xyra replied without looking at him. Jake studied the map. "What's the plan?" Xyra hesitated, her voice softer now. "The plan is to survive long enough to reclaim my throne. But even if I succeed, it may not be enough." Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" Xyra turned to him, her golden eyes meeting his. "My people have grown used to war. Peace will not come easily, even with me as their queen. I fear I may be fighting a battle I cannot win." Jake was silent for a moment, then said, "You don't have to do it alone." Xyra's expression softened, and for the first time, Jake saw something other than strength in her eyes. There was vulnerability, a glimpse of the weight she carried. "Thank you, Captain," she said quietly. "Your people are unusual. You fight not for conquest, but for survival. Perhaps that is why you are stronger than we believed." Jake smirked. "Don't go getting sentimental on me, Your Majesty. We've still got a long way to go." Xyra's lips curved into a faint smile. Indeed. Their moment was interrupted by the sound of alarms. The stronghold shook as explosions erupted outside. Jake grabbed his rifle, his heart pounding. Jenkins appeared, his face pale. "Captain, we've got incoming. It's the rebels. They found us." Jake turned to Xyra, who was already arming herself. "Looks like the fight's coming to us." She nodded, her regal composure returning. "Then we fight. Together." As the stronghold descended into chaos, Jake and Xyra stood side by side, ready to face the enemy. Despite their differences, they had become allies in the truest sense, bound by the same goal and the same determination to survive. The proposal, the aftermath of the battle, left the stronghold in ruins, but they had won. Barely. Fires smoldered in the wreckage, and the cries of the wounded echoed through the valley. Captain Jake Walker stood at the edge of the battlefield, his rifle slung over his shoulder, surveying the scene with a grim expression. His crew and Xyra's Loyalists moved among the rubble, tending to the injured and fortifying what was left of their defenses. Queen Xyra approached him, her silver armor scorched but still gleaming under the faint light of the twin moons. Her golden eyes seemed to carry both relief and calculation as she stopped beside him. "You fought well," she said, her voice steady but low. "Your tactics saved many lives." Jake glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "We survived. For now." Xyra tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You speak as if victory is not enough." Jake sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Because it's not. We held them off, sure, but they'll be back. Stronger. And next time, I'm not sure we'll be able to hold the line. Syra's gaze hardened. Then we must act quickly. The rebellion grows bolder with each passing day. If we don't strike first, they will destroy everything. Jake turned to face her fully. And what exactly do you expect me to do? This isn't my fight. Syra stepped closer, her expression intense. It is now, Captain. Whether you like it or not, your survival is tied to mine. Without me, the rebellion will target Earth next. You know this. Jake stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. She was right. As much as he hated to admit it, her survival might be the key to ending the war. Not just for her people, but for his as well. But before he could respond, Syra said something that caught him completely off guard. There is another way, she said, her voice softer now. Jake frowned. Another way. Syra hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. Among my people, there is a tradition, a bond stronger than treaties, stronger than alliances. It is called a life debt. Jake raised an eyebrow. A life debt? What does that mean? Syra took a deep breath. When one saves the life of another, the one saved is bound to the Savior. It is a sacred bond, one that cannot be broken. In my culture, it is often sealed through marriage. Jake blinked, certain he had misheard her. Marriage. Syra nodded, her gaze unwavering. By saving my life, you have already fulfilled the first part of the bond. If we marry, it will unite our people in a way no treaty ever could. My loyalists will rally behind me, and your leaders will see the value of an alliance. Jake laughed, but it was humorless. You're kidding, right? You think Earth's leaders are just going to accept this? They barely tolerate each other, let alone marrying into an alien empire. Syra's expression didn't change. They will have no choice. The alternative is war, a war neither of our worlds can afford. Jake shook his head, pacing a few steps away. This is insane. I'm a soldier, not a politician, and definitely not a husband. Syra followed him, her tone firm. You are more than a soldier, Jake Walker. You are a symbol. Your people see you as a hero. My people will see you as a savior. Together, we can rebuild what the rebellion seeks to destroy. Jake stopped, running a hand through his hair. And what about us? Do you even care about what this means for either of us personally? Or is this just a political move to you? Syra hesitated, and for the first time, Jake saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. It is both, she admitted. I will not lie to you, Captain. This is a means to an end. But I have come to respect you, to trust you. That is not something I say lightly. Jake stared at her, his mind racing. The idea was absurd, yet he couldn't deny the logic behind it. If it worked, it could save countless lives. But was he really willing to take that step? Before he could answer, Jenkins appeared, his face pale. Captain, we've got trouble. Jake turned sharply. What now? Jenkins pointed toward the edge of the stronghold, where a scout was waving frantically. We've picked up movement. A large force is heading this way. We don't have much time. Syra's expression hardened. The rebels are relentless. They know I'm here. They won't stop until they've destroyed everything. Jake tightened his grip on his rifle. Looks like we'll have to put this marriage proposal on hold. Syra's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. Very well. But the offer stands, Captain. Jake nodded, already moving toward the stronghold's defenses. Let's survive the night first. Then we'll talk. As the alarms blared and the stronghold prepared for another attack, Jake couldn't shake Syra's words from his mind. Marriage. An alliance stronger than any treaty. Could it really work? And more importantly, could he bring himself to take that step? The night was far from over, and with the rebellion closing in, the decision might be taken out of his hands entirely. The final battle. The stronghold buzzed with frantic energy as soldiers and crews scrambled to prepare for the impending assault. The rebels were coming in force, their numbers far greater than anything Jake Walker or Queen Xyra had anticipated. From his vantage point atop a crumbling tower, Jake could see the flicker of lights on the horizon. Enemy ships, ground forces, and armored vehicles moving steadily toward them. "This isn't a battle," Jenkins muttered beside him, his binoculars scanning the approaching army. "This is a massacre waiting to happen." Jake tightened his grip on his rifle, his jaw clenched. "Not if we fight smart." Jenkins lowered the binoculars and looked at him. "Smart won't be enough, Captain. There's no way we're holding this place." Jake turned to Xyra, who stood nearby, her golden eyes fixed on the horizon. Despite the dire situation, she exuded an unshakable calm. Her presence alone seemed to steady the soldiers around her. "What do you think, Your Majesty?" Jake asked, his tone laced with both respect and frustration. "Do we have a chance?" Xyra didn't look at him. "A chance, yes, but it will require sacrifice." Jake sighed. "It always does." She finally turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You've faced impossible odds before, haven't you, Captain?" Jake smirked, though there was no humor in it. "That's my job." "Then let us make the impossible happen," Xyra said, her voice steady and resolute. "If we fall here, the rebellion will win. But if we stand and fight, we can send a message, not just to my people, but to yours." Jake nodded. "All right, let's get to work." Hours later, the stronghold's defenses were as ready as they could be. The humans and Andarian loyalists had worked side by side, setting up barricades, deploying traps, and positioning heavy artillery salvaged from the stronghold's storage. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. Jake stood in the command center, going over the battle plan with Xyra and the other leaders. A holographic map displayed the stronghold and the surrounding terrain. "The main force will hit us here," Jake said, pointing to the southern wall. "That's where we're weakest. We'll need to funnel them into a kill zone." Xyra nodded. "Agreed. But they will likely send a secondary force to flank us from the east. We must be ready for that as well." Jenkins pointed to the northern ridge. "What about air support?" "They've got fighters, and we got, well, not much." Xyra's lips tightened. "Leave that to me. There are automated defenses in the stronghold that can be reactivated, but they will require manual oversight." Jake frowned. "You mean someone has to stay behind and control them?" "Yes," Xyra said, meeting his gaze. "It is a dangerous task, but it could turn the tide of the battle." "I'll do it," Jenkins volunteered, but Jake shook his head. "No, I need you on the front lines." Jenkins scowled. "Then I will do it," Xyra interrupted. Her tone left no room for argument. Jake stared at her. "You can't. If something happens to you." "If something happens to me, then it is my failure as queen," she said firmly. "This is my battle, Captain. I will see it through." Jake hesitated, but he knew she was right. "Fine, just don't get yourself killed." Xyra's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile. "I will try." The first wave hit at dawn. Rebel ships roared overhead, firing plasma bolts that shook the stronghold's walls. On the ground, enemy troops surged forward in a coordinated assault, their weapons lighting up the battlefield. Jake was in the thick of it, leading the defense at the southern wall. His rifle spat bolts of plasma, cutting down enemies as they tried to breach the barricades. Around him, his crew and Xyra's loyalists fought with everything they had. "Hold the line," Jake shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Don't let them through." Jenkins was beside him, firing a heavy plasma cannon. "This is madness," he yelled over the noise. "They just keep coming." "That's what they do," Jake replied. "Focus on what we can control." Above them, the automated defenses came to life, firing streams of energy at the rebel fighters. Zahira's efforts in the control room were paying off, but it was clear she was stretched thin. Jake could hear her voice over the comms, issuing commands and coordinating the defenses. "Captain, the eastern flank is under heavy attack," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "I am rerouting reinforcements." "Do it," Jake replied, ducking behind cover as a plasma bolt exploded nearby. "And keep those cannons firing." The battle raged for hours, the stronghold's defenders holding on by sheer willpower. Jake lost track of time, his focus narrowing to the immediate chaos around him. Every moment was a fight for survival. But then, something shifted. A loud explosion rocked the battlefield, and the rebel troops began to retreat. For a moment, Jake thought they had won, until he saw the massive walker emerging from the smoke. The towering war machine was unlike anything he had seen before, its legs stomping across the battlefield as it fired devastating blasts from its cannons. The defenders' weapons barely scratched its armor. "Fall back," Jake shouted, his voice hoarse. "Everyone, fall back to the inner defenses." As the troops retreated, Jake sprinted toward the command center. He found Syra at the control console, her hands flying over the controls. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but her focus was unshakable. "We've got a problem," Jake said, catching his breath. "That walker's going to tear us apart." Zyra didn't look up. "I am aware. There is one option, but it is risky." Jake frowned. "Define risky." Zyra turned to him, her golden eyes fierce. "The stronghold's reactor can be overloaded. If we lure the walker inside, we can destroy it." Jake's stomach dropped. "And take the whole stronghold with it." Zyra nodded. "It is the only way." Jake hesitated, his mind racing. "All right, but we're getting everyone out first." Zyra's expression softened. "Agreed." The plan was set in motion. As the defenders evacuated the stronghold, Jake and Sarah stayed behind to lure the walker into the trap. It was a desperate gambit, but it was their only chance. The final moments were a blur of chaos and adrenaline. Jake fired at the walker, drawing its attention as Tyra worked to overload the reactor. The war machine stomped after them, its cannons firing relentlessly. "Reactor is ready," Tyra called out. "We must go." Jake nodded, but before they could escape, a piece of debris blocked their path. The walker loomed closer, its weapons charging for a final shot. Jake looked at Tyra. "Go. I'll hold it off." She shook her head. "No, we leave together." With seconds to spare, they found an alternate route and sprinted out of the stronghold. The walker followed them inside, its massive frame crushing everything in its path. From a safe distance, Jake watched as the stronghold erupted in a blinding explosion, the walker consumed by the blast. The shockwave knocked him off his feet, and for a moment, everything went silent. When he opened his eyes, Tyra was beside him, her expression unreadable. "It is done," she said quietly. Jake nodded, his chest heaving. "Yeah, it's done." But as he looked at the devastation, he couldn't shake the feeling that their fight was far from over. A new beginning. The landscape was charred, the remnants of the stronghold reduced to smoldering ruins. Smoke rose from the wreckage, drifting lazily into the sky. Captain Jake Walker stood at the edge of the devastated battlefield, his eyes scanning the horizon. The echoes of the final explosion still reverberated in his chest, but there was no time to rest. The battle was over, and the future was uncertain. Beside him, Queen Syra looked out over the destruction, her face stoic, but her eyes betraying the weight of everything that had transpired. The stronghold, their last stand, had been. "You're still alive," Jake said quietly, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Syra turned to face him. "As are you. A miracle, I suppose." Jake didn't respond immediately, his thoughts spinning. The battle had been brutal, and the destruction was beyond anything he had imagined. The rebellion had been forced to retreat, but they would be back. He knew it wasn't over, not by a long shot. Yet there was something about Cyrus' presence, something that made him believe they had a chance. "We should have died there," Zyra continued, her voice softer now. "But we didn't. That means something." Jake glanced at her, his face hardening. "It means we got a second chance. A chance to rebuild. But we'll need more than just luck this time." Thyra nodded, her expression grim. "I will do whatever it takes. For my people. And for yours." Jake met her gaze, and for the first time, he saw something other than the queen of a broken empire. He saw someone who had been through the same hell he had, a leader burdened with impossible choices, yet still standing, still fighting. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear: whatever happened next, they would face it together. The days that followed were a blur of regrouping and planning. The rebellion had been shattered, but they were not entirely defeated. Zyra had sent emissaries to the loyalist factions across the empire, reaching out to those still willing to fight for her and the peace she had promised. Jake, for his part, had taken the lead in communicating with Earth's leaders. They were skeptical, of course, but the alliance forged through battle, through sacrifice, was undeniable. Jake sat in the command room, looking over the holographic map of the Andarian Empire. The war was far from over, but now they had something they hadn't had before: a strategy, a real chance for peace. Zyra entered the room, her armor gleaming, though the weight of everything they had endured still lingered in her eyes. She didn't need to say anything. Jake knew she had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, securing the loyalty of her people and laying the groundwork for a new era. "We've received word," she said, her voice measured, yet there was something in her tone that spoke of hope. "The last of the rebel forces are retreating. They'll need time to regroup, but they're in disarray. Now is the time to act." Jake leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "And what exactly do you want me to do? Push forward and wipe them out?" Zyra shook her head, her gaze unwavering. "No, we have no interest in total destruction. We need to show them we are not the monsters they've made us out to be. We need to offer them peace, or at least the chance to survive." Jake was silent for a long moment, weighing her words. He knew the cost of war. He had seen the horrors it left behind, on Earth, on Gyrath, everywhere. But peace, could it really be achieved? "I'll support whatever you think is right," he finally said, meeting her eyes. "But it's not just about saving your empire. It's about saving both our worlds." Zyra's expression softened for the first time in what felt like forever. "You're right. This is not just about me. It's about all of us." Jake stood up, his muscles stiff from the strain of battle. "Then let's make sure we do it right." The next few days were critical. The loyalist forces, though still small, had regrouped and begun moving toward the capital. Jake worked with Zyra's commanders to secure the borders, ensuring no further rebel factions could regroup. Earth's forces, under Jake's direction, also began to arrive, lending much-needed support. It wasn't just about defeating the rebels, it was about rebuilding what had been lost. The final confrontation came in the Andarian capital, a city that once thrived with the opulence and power of a galactic empire. Now it was a shadow of its former self, scarred by war and betrayal. Jake and Zyra led the charge into the city, flanked by both human and Andarian forces. The streets were eerily quiet as they moved through the ruins, but it was clear this was the last bastion of resistance. Zyra paused before the Grand Palace, the heart of her empire. She looked at Jake, her face unreadable. "This is it." Jake nodded. "We've come this far. Let's finish it." They approached the palace gates, which opened to reveal a small group of rebels led by Zyra's former allies. They stood, weapons drawn, but there was no hostility in their eyes, only weariness. Zyra stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "This is over. You can surrender, or you can die here." For a long moment, the rebels said nothing. Then one of them stepped forward. an older man with graying hair. His eyes were filled with regret. "You were once one of us, Tyre," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "You were our future." Zyra's expression softened. "I still am. But this path you've chosen has led to nothing but destruction." The man shook his head, lowering his weapon. "Then we surrender. For what it's worth, I am sorry." Jake stepped forward, offering a hand to the man. "It's not too late to change things. But it has to start with us. All of us." The rebels dropped their weapons, their faces filled with exhaustion but also the glimmer of hope. This was not a victory won with bloodshed. It was a victory won with the promise of something better. Zyra turned to Jake, her eyes filled with a quiet gratitude. "We've done it." Jake nodded, his heart heavy but hopeful. "Yeah, we've done it." The peace talks between Earth and the Andarian Empire were long, drawn-out affairs, but they were real. For the first time in years, both sides sat down as equals, working toward a future that didn't involve endless fighting. Jake stood beside Zyra as the final agreements were signed, the weight of their shared sacrifice evident in their expressions. This was just the beginning, but it was a beginning nonetheless. As the negotiations came to a close, Zyra turned to Jake. "The war is over, but there is still much to rebuild, much to heal." Jake met her gaze, his heart steady. "We'll do it together." Zyra nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Together. And for the first time in a long while, Jake felt that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for a better future.